these proceedings, and particularly as people of color. It's just grueling what they put people through. I mean, even they were talking today. Pastor Walker was talking about the identity, defining a woman. In this culture, in this society. I love that she just seems to be very impartial and about just the justice. There's no impartiality. She's not feeding into a lot of the scenarios of even being oppressed, or I think she made that really clear. She doesn't feed into somebody feeling less than, them being oppressed, and so I don't know. To me, it just seems that she's being really fair. But with that said, they're not being fair. The one gentleman who actually got up and walked away, I forget, but he was just very nasty, a Republican, and just walked away. But a woman just supported her and said, "You're doing outstanding," encouraged her in the midst of
right. I saw that.
Did you see that?
I saw that. And I found it interesting. It might be the same person, but I found it interesting that he was sharing a book with pictures, and he was sharing pictures of children who were racist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's ridiculous. How does a baby in a diaper understand racism?
Right. I know, and I love her response to that was no, that's nobody's born that way. That's something that's actually taught.
That's right, though. It's not only taught, but sometimes they're learning it.
Yes.
It's just being shared with them.
In an environment that they're socialized.
I know it. And of course, I do find it racism sad.
Yeah.
Because I've experienced, I've been able to see it most of my life.
Sure.
And I don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
I find it wrong. I pray against it, and of course I'm a member of our church.
Yes.
So this is important to me.
Yes.
To be a member of a black church.
Yeah, and it's important to you because we understand that it's really that we're brothers and sisters regardless of our ethnicity.
Yes, and that's what so many people don't understand, that we really are brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With that said, I think that you appreciate, and even if we talk about racism, and many people will feel as though they didn't know anything. They didn't own slaves. They're not responsible for the structural inequities and systems that have been set up, and don't. And to that point, many people will realize that who are Europeans like yourself, that you do live with privilege and you do benefit from what your ancestors did, and so appreciate that and use that to be able, even our sister like Ibina, who recognize that yes, you have privilege with race and maybe even class, and with those two things, utilize that to help equity for the systems that oppress black and poor and brown people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember, and this is something that you may or may not remember, but when you and I went to the Cure International Conference in Thailand.
Yes.
I shared a room in the hotel with a white woman.
Yes.
And she was not impressed with any conversation I was willing to have. And interestingly enough, there were 4 or 5 young black men in the hotel who were not at the conference, but came to me, put their hands out and said, "Ma'am, please let me carry that for you. Let me carry that book for you. Let me carry that into the conference room for you." They didn't want me to have to do any work, and they just kept helping me. And they were just sweet guys. And then they came to the table when we would go to eat in the dining room, and they would come over and say, "Are you being served properly? Are you satisfied?" You know, this kind. They just wanted to be sure that everything was correct. Well, it was interesting because the woman I was sharing the room with didn't want to sit with me, didn't want to associate with the young men who were coming and you know, introducing themselves to me. And then when we left and came back to America, I know you went to Australia,
yes,
but I came back to America. When that happened, the young black men that I was introduced to by them sent me information. They sent me Facebook comments, and they said, "Grandma, I miss you. Grandma, I love you. Grandma." And one of my grandchildren, my first number one grandchild, called me up on the phone and said, "Did you adopt somebody in Africa?" That's what she thought, that I adopted someone in Africa. And I said, "Actually, they adopted me."
How about that?
And that was amazing. And I still communicate with them on Facebook.
Right. Yes.
That was what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah, I think 3 years now, maybe.
Wow.
Yes.
So it's amazing. So there was no such thing as racism, as far as I was concerned, either in Thailand or in Africa.
Yeah.
Or in Dorchester.
You've not experienced that.
Well, I mean, I've overlooked it. I've seen it.
Yeah.
And I've encouraged people to understand that it's not necessary, that it's not true, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate. It really is. I heard even here in Boston on the St. Patty's Day parade, which was like the first event that they've had, post-COVID, or not even post-COVID, but this season of COVID, where there's a decrease. So now it was, the numbers have gone down enough, and the metrics, have gone are all in a place that they could have this event. Though it was scaled down, the big St. Patty's Day parade, but in that context of that, there was a group of people who were Nazis, and they had signs that said, "Keep Boston Irish," or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Did you hear about that or see that?
No, I didn't. I didn't hear about that. And I grew up in an Irish neighborhood, and so I knew all about St. Patty's Day. And I knew all the words to the song because I had to sing it. And, we celebrated it in my public school. But it's just amazing that there still are adults who are acting like being white or being Irish is better than something else.
Yeah. It's really unfortunate. I mean, it's one thing to have pride in your ethnicity and your culture. I mean, nothing's wrong with that. You're an Italian. Remember, you make authentic Italian food, even as we're preparing to celebrate your life. You talked about your family being able to cook some of the authentic Italian cuisine. And that's a beautiful thing, to keep culture alive and to celebrate your culture, whatever that culture might be. I love diversity of culture. And with that said, to think that one is better than the other, that's the unfortunate thing that I think comes from a place of fear. I think people feel as though if you raise one, or support, even particularly on the lens of equity. So if you're supporting people who are of color because of the disparities, even the fact that reparations and these kind of things that that we have not received and are still struggling to be able to catch up with. So the people feel as though that we're taking resources from white people. That whole notion that if you give black something, you're taking from white people to give to black people. Like that, it's not a either or. You know, there's enough resources for us all to have if we empower the most valuable resource that we have. That's people.
Well, what's interesting to me in my family is my Italian grandparents who raised me, my maternal grandparents who raised me, and my father's father who came from Sicilia, Sicily. They both came to this country in about 1900.
Okay.
And in 1900, there were many black people who had been allowed to become free. And to me, I saw them as in charge of America before my grandparents arrived. And I'm not sure that they all believed that that was true for them. I'm talking about African Americans in 1900.
Okay.
So it to me, I thought that they were ahead of me.
That was your perception.
Yeah, because they were born here before I was. They lived here before I did. So they knew more about America than I did. And I went to public school, of course, and I spoke Italian and English. And my teachers believed I was an immigrant because I spoke Italian. And I wasn't an immigrant. And so my white American teachers thought I was an immigrant.
Wow.
Figure that. How do you figure that?
And that was because you spoke Italian?
That was because I spoke Italian, yeah.
Wow.
And when I was in the 5th grade, finally, I had an Italian teacher. And she said, "Why are you always so behind in the extra educational knowledge?" And I said, "Well, the teachers won't let me get into anything except the things I have to do just to get through the class." And she said, "Wait a minute." So she went back and she spoke to every one of my teachers. And she came back to me and she said, "They did not know that you were an American."
Wow. And that was the only reason?
That was the reason.
Wow.
And she went and asked them directly.
Wow. Had nothing to do with your, ability to process, to comprehend, to matriculate, but solely because you were held back because of what they perceived your ethnicity to be.
Yes.
That's so unfortunate.
And my complexion was a little tiny bit darker than all the white kids.
Wow.
But, I was Italian, and I spoke 2 languages. And when I was in junior high and high school, I was given extra educational tasks because of that. But when I was in the first 5 grades, I was held back.
Wow. I think Eric wanted to share some comments or give some weigh in.
Good morning, Sister Louise. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine.
Excellent. So we were talking about St. Patrick's Day, and which sparked me to do some research real quick. So I'm on Wikipedia, and we're talking about when the Irish immigrated into the Boston area in the 19th century, 1800s. And they were also, and again, it goes back to learning your own history. And once you learn your history, you'll know that, all of us have gone through some type of oppression or stuff in that. And again, the Italians did when they came to Boston, the Irish did, the Jews did. So a little bit of history on the Irish when they came in, because there was a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry going on because they were mostly Catholics when they came in. And they were considered Anglo-Saxon population. And they had a Pope night, which was November 5th each year and stuff like that. But the whole thing about it is that when the Catholic French came around, they were at war. There was like this religious war going on between the French and the Irish Catholic. And in 1834, there was a couple of Irish Catholic from Charlestown that were accused of raping someone, and then they actually hung the two guys.
Oh my goodness.
Again, there's that disparity. They, why can't you understand what another population have gone through when yours have gone through similar?
Right.
It may not been as many.
That's a very negative experience.
Right. It may not have been as many, but it happened.
Yeah.
But it happened.
Sure.
Yeah, and it would have that experience would have been passed around to each of them.
But it seems like some races and some generations, they don't want to talk about the negative part of their history.
Right.
And as if it didn't happen. So, and the races that do, like the African American race, who wants to, keep that in the forefront of our history, we're looked down upon it. Like, why can't you just get over it? No, it's not something you just get over.
I know, but to me, when I began to understand Black Americans and meet Black Americans in school and in my neighborhood or at my church or someplace, I was just very excited that they had the advantage over me because they had been in America their families had been in America many years longer than my family. And that was apparently a misunderstanding on my part. Because some of the Black Americans did not have the advantage I thought they had.
I'm reading further. So in 1850, when the Irish was, being drove here because of the famine in Ireland, when they were coming to Boston in 1850, a group of African American living on Elm Street signed a petition to keep the Irish out of their neighborhood. So again, there's part of where that tension and that dissension is between Irish and blacks. But I'm sure today's youth don't even know about that.
Sure.
So where is it still coming from if it's not being taught?
I had an interesting experience. That Pastor Bruce and I used to broadcast from the Boston
Neighborhood Network?
The Neighborhood Network,
yes.
In Roxbury.
Yes.
Every week, the two of us would go there. And for about 8 years, I think, we did that. That was before Boston Praise Radio existed.
Yes.
And I went there, and there was a couple of students from the high school that were interns, and they were getting credits for doing work there. And when Pastor Bruce left the building, this young black woman came up to me, and she had tears in her eyes, and I said, "Are you all right? Why are you crying?" And she said, "I'm crying because you and that man are saying things that I don't understand." And I said, "Okay, what don't you understand?" And she said, "I don't understand that a white woman and a black man are friends. And I don't understand that when you come here to do your broadcast, you do your broadcast, and then you go out together, you ride in his car, or he rides in your car, and you come back again, and it's okay." And she said, I grew up in Boston, and I have never met a couple like you two." And I said, "Well, Pastor Bruce is my pastor as well as my friend, and he's married. I know his wife, and I have five children that I raised in another part of the Commonwealth. So there's, we have two other sets of families. And she said, but I don't understand how you could be friends.
Wow. Is that
she just couldn't get it.
Inconceivable. Wow. That's so unfortunate that people, that would be inconceivable to comprehend how people of two different races could be friends. So that must be some deep, steeped racism that she was,
well, she grew up with.
Right.
She must have grown up and been told, you have to do this, you can't do that,
Yeah.
And it was interesting because there was another person who worked at the studio there, and she said to me, she called me into her office, and she said, I've watched you and that man. And I said, that's my pastor. And so she said, I've watched you walk in, register, do your broadcast, walk out, come back another time. She said, you act like friends. Are you really friends? And I said, yes, we're friends, in addition to him being my pastor, because I go to his church.
That's right.
And she said, I am so happy to see that, because I have for many years wanted to have a white friend, and I've never been able to do it. So there were two women in that building. One was a high school student, and the other one worked there. Is that amazing?
It is amazing.
I thought it was amazing.
It really is. It's interesting. I'm curious your perspective in the context of mental health, and in the context of racism, and acknowledging the steeped racism that people have, and now with so much change happening, particularly with women of color, even as we're looking at potentially, in this, God willing, having the first black female to sit on the highest court, being the Supreme Court. I mean, here we are, and this is, and again, the contention that she's getting, even like with Clarence Thomas, what he went through, and so, what do you think about reparations? As we talk about the repair, as we talk about, it seems that everything is through the lens of equity right now. Everybody's, on the heels of George Floyd. There's a whole mindset of even people who are running for political office are all running on a platform and with a mandate to through the lens of equity. Of kind of creating.
Oh, I know it, because here we are in this century, 2022, and there is still racism around us, and there are still people who are afraid to have friendships with whites or blacks, depending on what color they are, and there are people that are upset with Asians. Why is that? There's no reason to do that, because Asians, cook in Chinatown, and people go to Chinatown to eat in the restaurants. And that seems to be all right for everybody. But why don't they consider it all right to have Asian friends?
I can't imagine. Well, it's interesting. Our mayor, Wu, who we know is Asian, I was pleased that she, as well as a number of entities, spoke out against the Nazi white supremacy, if you will.
Exactly. That is horrible.
They were like, there's no place for that hate here in the city, and they were not invited, they're not welcome. But they could not tell people if they did if they had a peaceful presence, they could not exclude them, because what their protest was done within the context of what is a legal right. But nonetheless, they really made it really clear, the mayor, as well as elected officials who were white from South Boston and so forth, said this is not what we represent. So it's one thing to have Irish pride, but we're not this notion of keep Boston Irish and this exclusivity and racism. Like that's not something that is.
I know it, and particularly to allow it to be somehow broadcast during the parade.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as she said, they didn't know that it was going to be there. So here you are just walking past it. And people captured it because it was so offensive. And, apparently they showed up at other kinds of protests. And the powers that be know who this particular group of folks are, as they're concealed, but wanted to put on blast that this was still unfortunately happening. And I just appreciate the collective pushback against it, saying, yes, we see it, and also saying that, we're not afraid of it either. That was the other piece about it, was, acknowledging it's something that exists. It's not welcome. We don't subscribe to that. We don't appreciate that. But with that said, that we also are not afraid of it. So if you want to manifest and say, here we are, and, we're confronting it and saying we're against that, and we're not afraid of you. I thought that was an interesting piece to add, that they were saying that we're going to stand up collectively against when we see this happening in our city and other places. So I really was pleased to see the pushback, and I hope that will continue, even as we're talking about having a hearing, to talking about changing Faneuil Hall. Kevin Peterson and the New Democracy and others are working to change the name of Faneuil Hall, because we know that was a slave owner and that was an auction block, and to have a public apology and to be able to have hearings with regard to reparations or payment in lieu of services rendered, as Detective Ellison often likes to say. But however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, there needs to be some equity and some acknowledgement of the oppression. Even as Eric was saying, there's communities that have all suffered periods of oppression, whether they were the Irish, whether they were, Italian. But the difference, I think, is chattel slavery. And not that we can compare pains, because I don't think we can. But I think, with chattel slavery, the difference is we were taken from our culture as African Americans. As an African American, I had the privilege of going with you to Rwanda. It was surreal, because my identity as an African American is just that. It's American, quite candidly. It's Black American, but that's almost like a second-class citizen within this country. That, yes, the Constitution said at one point that we weren't even fully human, and you can amend that, take the words out, but not necessarily change a mindset of a people who will still perceive you that way. But I appreciate what Ketanji Brown was saying, that she doesn't see, we're not the victims, but we do have to acknowledge that there have been some disparities, and that there needs to be some things to be put in place to facilitate equity, though that's not an excuse to be able to say, oh, we're the victims and we just have to embrace a victim mentality.
Well, I remember that when the Italian was executed for a crime he did not commit. He did not commit a murder, or a robbery, but he was executed and buried in the same cemetery my grandparents are buried. And I could remember that there was a lot of screaming initially when it first happened, because the Italians were upset that he was not released from prison and just released, but the governor of the state at that time thought that it was appropriate to execute him. And the man who had actually committed the murder and at the same time had admitted who he was, and he was released. He was released, but he wasn't Italian. But the Italian was executed.
Wow!
And so for a couple of years there was a lot of tears and hate and all kinds of feelings being passed. But then I recognized that within Italian families,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't talk about the execution. They didn't talk about it to their children. They didn't say anything about it. It was like it never happened.
Wow. And why do you think that was?
What?
And why do you think that horrific piece of history? I mean, I think, even if we talk about, critical race theory, a lot of folks are opposed to it. But I mean, history is the history, and I think it's important to know the history because, the good, the bad, all of that is history that we just can't kind of edit and whitewash or, to be comfortable that we don't deal with the reality of the bad that actually happened, because I heard it something to the degree of if we fail to learn from our history, something to the degree that we're doomed to repeat it. The essence of it may not be verbatim, but the essence of that is, so we have to have the courage to look at our history and to be able to.
That's true, but I also want to remind our listeners,
yes,
that the execution was Sacco and Vanzetti.
Yes. I'm glad you said that. I was just pulled it up here actually. Yeah, and it's funny because I actually saw there is. Let me see, what church is it? Is a church on Boylston Street, Universalist Unitarian, perhaps. No, Community Church. That's what it is. The Community Church of Boston, on Boylston Street. They actually have a plaque inside there that has a plaque of these two gentlemen. That was the first that I had ever heard of this story of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were
right. And the other thing that might be interesting to you as well as to our listeners is I have relatives named Sacco.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So, but it wasn't spoken about 20 years later.
Wow. And why do you think that it was not spoken about?
I think that they just believed that they didn't want white people. It was white people.
Yep.
They didn't want white people to know that there had been executions, because there might be a reason to do it again.
Wow. Yeah, it's in here. The deaths of Nico Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in Charlestown Prison in Massachusetts marked the end of a raucous 7-year legal and political battle that captivated people across the United States and the world.
And what was the date?
That was, it says August 23rd, 1927.
Yeah, that was before I was born. 1927.
Yes.
Yeah.
90 years ago, Deacon.
Right.
90 years ago on August 23rd, 1927, two Italian immigrants were
Italians were mistreated by a number of other groups of people in the Boston area.
And again, as horrific as that is, but do you see really a distinction where, again, like the Italian culture is still maintained? They're even here in Boston, right? Like they have the North End, right? The North End's there, right. And the authentic Italian food, the businesses, the culture is there. As you said, Chinatown, right? There's a Chinatown, and every place that you go is a Chinatown, right? So that the Asian culture and economics is there. The Indians, or the Native Americans, as my nephew reminds me they should be called, the Native Americans who were here, some level of reparations, i.e. the casinos, the reservations, right? But and so a lot of these cultures have had some level of acknowledgement. One, maintenance of their culture. That's first and foremost. Second of all, because of that, they've been able to advocate and do what they have to do to be able to have some level of reparations or equity, or at least acknowledgement, and ask for forgiveness of what has been done. Where African Americans, I don't see that has happened is this country was built on the blacks as slaves. So literally you come to a place and that is already populated by people being the indigenous Indians, push them off their own land. Now they still have their culture and so forth. They were able to maintain that some kind of way. But now then you go to a continent, being Africa, made up of countries, and take people against their will, pack them like, sardines in the bottom of a ship. I mean, inhumane conditions where I just can't even imagine. You're chained and shackled in this darkness, and your waste is just there, and it's inhumane because you didn't think they were fully human, and then to come here and to be stripped of your culture, stripped of your language, and then treated inhumanely and free labor, and then you're told within the country that you're here, me as an African American who was born here, that you're considered a second-class citizen, though you were born here, and don't get the benefits of a full American, though you're born here in the United States. And so, for me, there is a difference with the indentured servants and the and even the oppression that has happened with a lot of different races, in contrast to chattel slavery. There's just, to me, that's not been even acknowledged, and that even the critical race people don't want to talk about that because afraid that it's going to make white people feel uncomfortable, because they're acknowledging this thing happen. I mean,
yeah, I know, and the current situation where you're likely to see Nazis or swastikas or that is horrendous, because that is wrong. That is wrong. That took place in Europe, where I think 6 million Jews were killed.
Wow. I mean, yeah, the Holocaust. I mean, that's one. Even as I go downtown and I see they have, near Government Center, they have the I don't know what you call it, but like an exhibit. What is it? A memorial. Thank you. The Holocaust Memorial. Yeah, that has the names and so there's that. Numbers. Yeah. Has numbers of people that were
all those little etched numbers.
Yeah.
Those they didn't have names. They had numbers. On the bottom of it. On the bottom is survivors.
Okay.
And comments and statements from them about what they went through.
Wow.
But all those 6 towers. Yeah. Is like a 6-digit number that represents each person.
Wow. But so that's there. There's some the Jews will never let you forget the Holocaust, as they should not. I mean, I hear the stories, and it's horrific to just think that you could try to literally get rid of a whole race of people in the ways that they did at the concentration camps, and to hear the survivors of that. It's just inhumane and inconceivable to see how people could do that. With that said, that story, it continues to be told, and they continue to have community that they maintain even economically. And so I long for the day that as African Americans that there can be some acknowledgement and some repair. Because, and even in the context of this broadcast, mental health in your neighborhood, that's very traumatic. Trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma.
I know, and it includes blacks, whites, Asians, and original Americans.
In the Native Americans?
Native Americans, yeah. I mean, those people are all... Well, because this country wasn't all American in a sense of one nationality or one color or one look. It was a combination of different cultures. And when the ships came over from Africa with the slaves on board,
Mm-hmm.
some of them jumped off the ship.
Yes. Yes.
And they were actually collected by people who were living on our islands,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yes,
Nantucket and what's the other one?
Cape Cod. I don't know.
Yeah,
Wherever there was water and there's land, there's little islands you can swim in,
Yes,
and a little
right.
piece of land you got to get onto.
right.
And from those places, create culture and create community.
Yeah, and it was believed that the captain of the ship thought that the slaves drowned when actually they were saved
Wow.
by these other people who live on the couple of islands off of the Cape Cod.
Wow. Wow. The way that I see it almost is that, we're one human family globally. And to think even, if you and I as believers, we go back to, the creation account where God made mankind, humanity in his image. And I happen to believe that I was in Africa. I don't really have any substantiation for that. But there actually, if you look and you see some of the places that are around there, it looks as though that was Africa. The Garden of Eden and so forth was in Africa. So to me, that's the motherland, right? And scientists will even tell you that white comes out of black, not the other way around in terms of color.
Right.
Right.
And so we're one family. And think about it, even getting back to biblically, the Tower of Babel, that was the notion of unity. They were building a tower and they all spoke one language. At this particular point, they spoke one language, even as a human race, and were building this tower to ascend up into heaven, and were making progress because they spoke one language and they had one agenda. And God had to literally supernaturally speak through them, and that was the origin of languages. But people began to speak Italian or Vietnamese or French, and so they couldn't communicate with each other to continue to build this tower. So the French, if you spoke language was a thing that made you come together, and then you're at different places geographically across the continent, across the world, and the weather and so forth. If you're in Alaska, different places that you are we're people as creatures. We're adaptable. So your skin tone and all those kind of things. If you're a place that's a hot place, you need melanin. If you're a place, so I would imagine we kind of, our color, our culture, all that kind of stuff, language, we created for survival, but ultimately that we all spoke one language prior to the Tower of Babel, and that literally the language was a thing that was to separate us from ascending up into heaven, but we also then created cultures and communities. What do you think, Eric? I see your face.
Now, I was smiling because you was talking about the Tower of Babel, and there's a company out there that called Babel that teaches other languages.
Really?
Yeah, so it was just
The parallel.
parallel in
there
that.
are all kinds of
But
changes.
I wanted to share something with
well.
you guys because many years ago I was a tour guide in Boston, and I would take the tours through what we were
He
talking
needs to
about.
be closer to a microphone.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so many times I would take the tours with our segways through the Holocaust Memorial.
Oh wow.
And I was looking up to see if I could find it. There was each tower, there's 6 of them, represented a concentration camp. And they put a lot of thought into building that because under each one, there's smoke coming out of
Yes.
it. And it gives you that feel of the heat coming from the concentration camp. So, but there's one carving from a Lutheran pastor who's also a survivor from the Holocaust that invoked the most emotions from the people I took on the tour. If you don't mind, I'll read it for you. They came first for the communists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak up because I wasn't Jew. Then they came for the trade unionist. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics. I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me. And by that time, there was no one left to speak up.
Wow.
And that wall, that thing invoked the most emotions out of a lot of the things that the people I took on tour.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people felt self-conflicted because how many times did they see something and didn't speak up?
Yes.
You know?
That's profound.
Yeah.
It is profound because that speaks to the fact that we are one family. We're one, and it's so true. If we don't
But it
speak,
reminds me, I'm sorry
no,
for
go ahead.
interrupting you.
No.
But it reminds me of Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
you don't see the different cultures. It's primarily, I mean, we're either men or women.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to go to heaven,
Mm-hmm.
we have to pay attention
Mm-hmm.
and do what Jesus told us.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't do that, then we might not get to heaven.
Sure.
But it has nothing to do, the
Mhm.
Bible has nothing to do with black skin, white skin,
Mm-hmm.
Asian,
Mhm.
whatever,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just not focused. There's no focus on that.
All right. Well, I think the point is as in the Bible where we are one in Christ, and and that's His character, right? I mean,
There you go.
Even in the creation account, when God made man in His image, though I happen to believe that that the first one was brown or black, right? But so what? And that's on because again, scientific.
Well, the Egyptians were black.
Right. And so that's not a better or worse than it's just a fact, right? And so
Right.
so if that be the case, and the fact that white came from that again is God creating the diversity of humanity. But again, what I love about that is God said, "Let us," and I believe the "us" is referring to God, the eternal Father, Jesus, God manifested in the flesh, who was tempted in all points as we are, yet the only person who went through the thing we call life in human flesh that never once sinned, right? And the Holy Spirit, I believe that's what that us is. Let us make mankind, male, female, humanity in our image, character, personality, attributes, love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, meekness, and self-control. That's fruit of the Spirit that has nothing to do with your gender or your race or your class.
Right. That saves a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
And attitude about racism.
Yes. And racism, about classism, about phobia, any of those kind of things, when we understand that we're one and we're commanded, the Bible says, "Owe no man nothing but love." And so we who subscribe to that as believers, it's a beautiful, wonderful thing because we see each other through the eyes of grace and of faith, and recognize that we're interconnected to each other, and we're dependent all upon God, and it's His grace and His mercy that we all are not consumed. One of my favorite scriptures, Lamentations 3:21-23 says, "Therefore this I recall to my mind," which we talk about mental health in your neighborhood. This is a mental thing. We have to constantly be cognizant, each individually doing the introspective reflection and being really intentional and being cognizant of the fact that we're one family globally. That's my brother. That's my sister. Whomever it is, that we see humanity globally as one family. And it's just a beautiful, wonderful thing when you can do that and don't have this thing where you feel less than or you feel better than, or have fear around anything or anyone. You realize that every creation is uniquely God's workmanship and necessary. There's something we have to gain and something we have to give, something we have to learn and something we have to teach in every single one of those relationships.
I know, and I learn it on a regular basis reading God's Word.
Yes.
So that's interesting. I think I'm running out of time.
You are. Your engineer says you got about 4 minutes.
Ah.
It's flown by.
Well, it's interesting that we were able to make an adjustment today to the fact that Pastor Bruce was not available.
Yes.
And that you were available.
I'm so pleased, and Eric's available too. He's here engineering behind the scenes.
I was about to say, and Brother Eric was available as well. Yes.
We're family.
Well, I love the fact that both of you do a little reviewing of the history that we talk about.
Yes.
You look up something about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's true. That's Eric's the one who kind of initiated that, so he had me doing some research in that regard too.
That's good stuff.
It is good stuff. By the way, Douglas W. Fitz Sr. is with us and said good morning. I should want to acknowledge
who?
Douglas W. Fitz, Fitts Sr. is on the Facebook Live feed, as well as your granddaughter Jennifer O'Neill is with us on this morning.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yes, indeed. So again, always pleased to be with you, Deacon. I'm just curious. With regard to cure, I know that you and I serve on that, and
well, I think we should call a meeting and try to recruit some members.
That sounds great.
Yes.
That sounds great.
So we should do that because you guys are in that place on a regular basis, so maybe we can meet there.
That sounds perfect.
Upstairs, in one of the rooms.
That sounds great. It sounds great. We got to continue your legacy.
Very good.
All
we
right.
have to do it.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll be back next week.
Yes.
So is it? What did you say? 4 minutes?
Let me see, Brother Eric. We got 1 minute. 1 minute and 20. 1 minute and 20 seconds and counting.
Well, 1 minute. I want to thank you for participating today. I also want to thank Brother Eric and those people who are listening and watching.
My pleasure.
So we'll do something next week as well.
Yes.
Same day of the week, same time of the day. Wednesday from 10 to 11. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
In your neighborhood, where you live, it can be in your hospital or it can